Hello, BookTube. We're doing a mandatory read-along on this channel in November. This is Nonfiction November, so we are doing a nonfiction read-along. It's only the second mandatory read-along that I've imposed on all of YouTube. Yes, not just all of BookTube. The beauty channels also, the Dude Bro motocross channels, the boat building channels, the gardening channels. They all have to do this. It's mandatory. Okay? I don't usually flex my awesome authority in this way, but in this case, I thought it was well worth it. So in the month of November, we are doing a mandatory read-along of no less than Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of the Species. And we're reading 100 pages a week. So you do 100 pages. You don't have doesn't have to be the Penguin Classic. It can be any edition of this that you want. We're reading about 100 pages a week of Origin of the Species, and this was made. It was published by Darwin sort of hurriedly in 1859. He'd been working on a grand concept, a grand scientific explication of his understanding of a process he called natural selection. He'd been working on an enormous and scholarly book along those lines for years, decade. When he suddenly got in the mail, the last thing you want to receive in the mail from a colleague named Alfred Russel Lawrence, he got, Alfred Russel Wallace. He got from Wallace. Why did I have Lawrence on the mind? Anyway, he got a packet in the mail from someone who said, "I've been thinking about this. What do you think?" And it was exactly Darwin's idea. Horrifying. Absolutely horrifying. So Darwin and his friends arranged a quick, relatively obscure publication of a précis of that paper. Its author was on the other side of the world and did not know anything about this. And they also arranged for a reading, and whatnot. And then they sort of let it die. It got no notice whatsoever. And Darwin, instead of writing his massive treatise on natural selection, decided time is of the essence and wrote instead the closest thing that he could come to, a popular explication of his idea, his central, incredible idea. And the book sold out immediately. Its first edition sold out immediately. It had other editions. They also sold out. It became talked about everywhere. It has never been out of print. It is, in my opinion, the single most important single author book ever written. And to understand why that is, you really have to understand what the world thought of itself, what the world thought of natural processes before this book appeared. The standard given idea, there were exceptions. In the 1830s, Sir Charles Lyell published a book on geology that deeply affected a younger Charles Darwin, deeply affected him, in which Lyell proposed that the only explanation that makes sense for geological formations is gradual formation over time, vast amounts of time. There was a seed planted there of an idea, but by far the general ruck of ideas about the natural world when Darwin's book first appeared was that all things were immutable, that all species, all kinds of animals and life forms on Earth were immutable and immutably created by their creator, by God, to be what they are. Butterflies, whales, giraffes, made. Now, incremental ideas that maybe that wasn't true, ideas that maybe no, instead they change, maybe instead of being made, things change into what they are. Ideas like that have been around for a long time, and they had been postulated in more specific form all through the 1830s and 40s, and a little bit before that, including by a member of Darwin's own family. But this book took the whole concept and moved it away entirely from theology. And that was an explosion. Because Darwin's book doesn't say that some things change gradually from their original creation. He says it's change all the way down. His book says that evolution by means of natural selection will create all of the forms that you see around you in the world. And it will also create all the forms that you've ever seen around you in the world. All the way back to the beginning. Darwin points out, influenced by Malthus, he points out that living organisms, produce more offspring than can possibly survive. And he extrapolates from that fact, that simple fact, which you only have to, if you breed dogs, breed cats, if you watch animals in the wild, you'll see that in a heartbeat, that litters are typically very big. And in the, down, so to speak, lower in the animal kingdom, think of a seahorse, for instance. They spurt out whole clouds of offspring. Not all of those are going to survive. Think about gigantic sea turtles. They lay gigantic mounds, clutches of eggs. Maybe one of those will survive. And that's been true forever. Darwin looked at those horrible odds in the natural world, and he made some assumptions. He started to make some deductions about that maybe there's a reason why some of those offspring survive. And that maybe those reasons are propagated in the next generation. He bred pigeons. He loved and kept dogs his whole life. He was able to see some of these things working right in front of him. His tremendous revolutionary idea was to say, that's all there is. It's not that that's a tool of some unseen deity, and it's not that deity uses that tool sometimes but not other times. His underlying idea in Origin of the Species was that's all there is. It's just population and pressure on that population and natural selection winkling out survivors. What another writer later referred to as survival of the fittest, which Darwin thought was sort of an inelegant phrasing of his idea, but nevertheless he did in his own lifetime come to accept it. He told a friend that originally, when he thought about the concepts in this book and realized that this book would be the death knell to the idea of immutable species, that if his ideas are true, then there would be no such thing as immutable species. And if there's no such thing as immutable species, there's no such thing as created life. And if there's no such thing as created life, and you can see where that goes, it doesn't take more than a minute to sit back and extrapolate all the things that are utterly destroyed by this book. Darwin told a friend of his that when he thought about what the concepts in his book did to the idea of immutable species, it felt like he was committing a murder. And he, in very real senses, was. Because once this book appeared, and it has the incredible persuasiveness of self-evident logic. Once you see it, once someone puts it forward, suddenly, of course, okay. Once you see it written out on paper, and Darwin, he uses very plain language in this book. This is not the scientific treatise that he wanted to write. This is a very plain, popular approach. He calls it an abstract. Once you see it laid out in front of you, then you think, of course. Many readers, original readers of this book when it first appeared, of course, everybody gave their opinion of it. And many original readers of the first edition, which is this Penguin edition, said, well, of course, when you lay it all out like that, anybody could think of it, but nobody did. Nobody did. That's the whole thing about truly elegant scientific understandings, whether it's, Copernicus or Einstein or Darwin or Newton. The thing about these truly elegant scientific understandings is that once you see them, you immediately go, ah. In fact, Thomas Huxley, the famous Darwin's bulldog, defender of the whole idea of evolution by means of natural selection, actually did that. He actually did that gesture. He did this, I should have had a V8. He actually did the hand to the forehead gesture. But a lot of other people did too. And the simple logical irrefutability of the book, of its basic idea that species evolve, simple as that life forms react to pressure on their population groups by evolving, that populations evolve. The simple logic of that thing made this book a bomb that went off in the pews of organized religion. And organized religion, the ranks of organized religion, have hated Darwin ever since. And they've gone after this book every way that they can. Every single way that they can. That started right away. But it actually continues, including in a hotbed of brainless, violent religious fundamentalism. And I, of course, am not referring to Tehran. I'm referring to America, specifically Texas. I know more than is healthy for me about the Texas school system and the textbooks that they approve. And Texas wields an enormous club when it comes to those books. They wield an enormous budget. So not only do they make or break the coverage of a lot of basic science and technology, history and whatnot in textbooks in their own state, but also thanks to their buying power in states all over the West and the South. It's an enormous reach. And the Texas school department hates, and always has hated, the idea of Darwin, the idea of evolution by means of natural selection. You've all heard of the Scopes monkey trial, and there have been many trials since that. Evolution has been in the courts at least as much as it's been in the classrooms, and it always wins. Almost always wins. Almost always it wins a victory against people who want magic taught in schools. Against grown adults who say, well, no, I never read this book, of course. I don't have the primary schooling to read this book, even if I wanted to. But I know sort of kind of what it says, and I know that it removes God from the equation, and therefore no one can read it. I don't want it taught to my kids. I want my kids taught that all the kinds of animals, not species or subspecies or clades or whatever, but kinds, were created by God on the first day, in the book of Genesis, and named by Adam, and saved on the ark, and that's it. And they don't change. And religious fundamentalists in this country are very powerful. They're very numerous, and they've gone after this book 8 Ways from Sunday, saying they prey on the very weaknesses that Darwin himself brings up in this book. Not in the chapters that we're reading today, but later on in the book, he brings up what are some of the weaknesses. Like any serious scientific thinker, he thinks, well, what would disprove my idea? He mentions transitional forms. Of course, we have a fossil record, right? We have a fossil record. There are extreme fringe groups of religious fundamentalists here in America who say that there are no such thing as fossils, that they're all fake. But even most religious fundamentalists will agree that there are fossils. They just think that they were created during the flood, the Noachian flood. That most certainly did not happen. It's amazing how often I have to correct people in books, in reviews of that, where they just start at that as a starting point. I have to point out, well, in addition to everything else that's wrong with this book, also the book is taking that this obvious myth, Noah's flood, took place, that it actually happened. It certainly did not. So, you're wrong there, too, and you'd be surprised, or maybe you wouldn't be, how many editors, secular editors, people who aren't religious at all, haven't been to church in forever, will leave a note on those reviews and write back to me and say, do you have any proof that Noah's flood didn't happen? It's the first I've heard of it. Nevertheless, in Darwin's day, the fossil record was barely a shadow of what it is. It was only barely beginning. And Darwin didn't know anything about what would come, of course, and he also didn't know about genetics. He didn't know about DNA. So he looked at his own theory and said, well, if what I'm saying is true, and organisms have been evolving since organisms have been alive on Earth, then the fossil record should be replete with transitional forms, with forms that look different from either the one they started with or the one they ended up with. And if those aren't there, then my theory must be wrong. Something must be seriously wrong with it. And even in his own lifetime, transitional forms were starting to be found. Archaeopteryx was starting to be found. We were starting to see what the fossil record abundantly shows, which is that evolution by means of natural selection certainly does happen. Darwin was right. The fossil record clearly shows that. There are vast amounts we can trace through the fossils, through fossilized bones and remains, the entire development of whole species, and see what was happening. We can see that they were changing by means, very slowly over time, by means of natural selection. And that was before we started to be able to do genetic analysis. Genetic analysis confirms all that on its own. So that as many paleobotanists will say, or paleobiologists will say, we don't need any fossils. We could have no fossils. We could live on a tectonically even far more active planet than we live on currently. We live on a very tectonically active planet. It's kind of a miracle that we have fossils at all. But if it were even worse, if our rain were more acidic or more often, if we were more tectonic and there were no fossils, paleobiologists point out we wouldn't need them. The genetic record amply proves what Darwin's theory in every detail. Virtually nothing of this book has failed in the last 150 years. It is a pure thought exercise that is just marvelously grounded. And Darwin himself says it at the end of the chapters that we're reading today. He puts it in that clear Victorian prose that I love so much. He says, let's see here. He's talking about how natural selection doesn't always have to act slowly. If you isolate a group, if there's special pressures on that group, it can act faster. But he says, slow though the process of selection may be, if feeble man can do so much by his powers of artificial selection, in other words, with dogs and horses and pigeons, I can see no limit to the amount of change, to the beauty and infinite complexity of the co-adaptions between all organic beings, one with another and with their physical conditions of life, which may be affected in a long course of time by nature's power of selection. Notice, see, so Darwin is pointing out there what becomes obvious in the course of reading this book, which is if you take this mechanism that he's describing and you add in time, then you get the world that you see around you. You don't need anything else. No, as Sherlock Holmes would put it, no ghosts need apply. You do not need gods. This removes them from the equation, and it does it more effectively than any polemic could possibly do. There had been, in Darwin's own day and since and long before, there were fiery polemics against the idea of gods, against the idea that gods created anything on Earth. This is so much more effective than a polemic because it isn't polemical. You heard that passage. Darwin talks all the time throughout this book about the beauties and the intricacies of the thing that he's describing. He's clearly celebrating the world that he is describing, a world in which there are no gods, in which nothing is created ex nihilo, in which things evolve over time under pressure from their natural environment. It's a bombshell. And that it should be done by a quiet intellectual out in the countryside made it all the more effective. That Darwin was not Huxley. He was not a firebrand. He was not a loud talker of any kind. Instead, he was quiet, shy, and retiring, and perfectly willing to consider the weaknesses of his own theory. We'll go through some of those when we get to that part in this book. But the 100 pages that we're reading today lays out the basics. And if I'm assuming this is your first time reading The Origin of Species, most people have heard about this book and know all about what it says, but have never read it. And if that's true for you, I would love to know what you make of it, what you're making of all of this so far. So we are going to continue with our mandatory read-along. We will read the next 100 pages of The Origin of Species next time, which will happen not on a Monday, I'm hoping, but on a weekend, as read-alongs should. So I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.